Good day. 2021 is proving to be a rich year in terms of new military technology developments and deployments. And today I'm going to talk about the S-500 air defense system that the Russians now say they're now preparing to deploy and whose tests have been completed. The Russians, by the way, refer to the system as the S-500 Prometheus, after Prometheus, the Greek titan who stole fire from the gods and gave it to humanity, thus creating the basis of human civilization. I'm not quite sure why it has been given this classical name, but in any event, I will refer to it over the course of this program simply as the S-500. I would add also the customary words I always make at the start of programs like this. I am not a scientist, a technically qualified person, a military person, a person who has a engineering background. So what I say about these systems is based on my knowledge of what I've read in secondary sources, in published sources. These are, I should add, highly classified systems. And of course, also they are informed to some extent by history. Now, the S-500 has been much talked about, and it's clear that so far as the Russians are concerned, it is a major program and one which has been given enormous priority by the Russian government and by the Russian defense establishment. And I think I would quickly say that in this, Russia is acting according to a tradition that extends back to the 1950s, when Russia became the first country to start producing surface-to-air missiles on an industrial scale. Now, I'm going to say a little about this history first, because I do think it provides some of the context for the S-500 development. Now, basically, Russian air defense technology dates to 1950, when the Soviet leader of the time, Joseph Stalin, instructed that an air defense system needed to be created around Moscow to protect the Soviet capital from US bombers potentially equipped with nuclear weapons. At that time, the Soviets felt themselves to be massively outmatched by the far more powerful US Air Force, and looking for some means to defend Moscow, they decided that they would develop it on the basis they would develop a defense system based on surface-to-air missile technology. Now, surface-to-air missile technology had been considered in Germany during the Second World War. There was even a system called Wasserfall, which had been some work had been done by the Germans during the Second World War, but which was never brought into service. But in practice and in fact, surface-to-air missile technology, as we know it, began with this project that Stalin initiated in 1950, and which resulted in a massive program to defend Moscow from American nuclear bombers. And the system that emerged is one which the Russians referred to as the S-25, and which became, in a way, the first of the many surface-to-air missiles that the Soviet Union and then Russia since then has produced. Now, I should say that Westerners are very ill-informed about the S-25 program in Russia to this day. In terms of its sheer scale, it is comparable to the Manhattan program in the United States, which produced the nuclear bomb. And it's to this day notable that elements of its infrastructure survive and continue to be used by the military in and around Moscow, including the ring roads that circle Moscow. that were intended to provide logistic supplies to the various missile stations that were to be created, and of course the command bunkers. And the S-25 system that eventually emerged consisted of a very large surface-to-air missile and a very complicated system of radars, which basically provided the Soviet Union's initial airborne early warning system, which it continued to build upon throughout the 1950s and 1960s. And this massive investment in developing the S-25 system undoubtedly provided the Soviets and then the Russians with the industrial and technological base which they have used ever since to develop ever new generations of ever more advanced surface-to-air and missiles, and increasingly now anti-ballistic missiles. Now, I should say that the S-25 was then succeeded in the late 1950s and early 1960s, or perhaps not so much succeeded as supplemented by two new missile systems, the S-75 Dvina and the S-125 Pechora, which became well known in the West as the SAM-2 and the SAM-3. The SAM-2 was exported by the Soviets to North Vietnam during the Vietnam War, and the Americans encountered it there. And the S-125 was exported by the Soviets to Egypt and was used by them in the fighting against Israel in the 1970s. And so these two systems are reasonably well known. But I should say that alongside these air defense systems, which were developed to provide air defense of the Soviet homeland and territorial air defense, if you wish, the Soviets also began to launch in the 1960s an entirely separate program to provide mobile air defense missiles to protect their army, their ground forces. And we are also, so those who are familiar with military affairs will know about some of these weapon systems that began to appear in the 1960s. The Russians all gave them all mathematical names: Krug, Kub, and Rom, circle, cube, and rhombus. They're also better known perhaps in the West as the SAM-4, the SAM-6, and the SAM-8. The SAM-6 was also exported by the Russians to Egypt and Syria, and the Israelis encountered it during the Yom Kippur War and again in the fighting in Lebanon in 1982. And it has in fact been deployed in several military conflicts around the world. The SAM-8, rather less well known, it was deployed in places like Angola and has also seen action in various places around the world. Anyway, we had therefore a whole generation of new missile systems appearing in the 1960s, and in the 1960s also the S-75 Dvina and S-125 Pechora, which, as I said, provided air defense for the Soviet homeland, were replaced by another missile system, the S-200, which is a much more powerful and far more advanced missile system, which the Soviets did not widely export, but of which there are still some operational units in Syria. And then in the late 1970s, the Soviets began an entirely new generation of air defense missile systems. Firstly, they developed at this time a anti-ballistic missile defense system in and around Moscow, much of which used the infrastructure left over from the S-25 program of the early 1950s. This is the A-135 system. And of course, there was also the S-300 family of missiles, and it's important to say that this is a large family of missiles. This is not a single missile, but various missiles all operating together as part of a single system, but one that gets extensively modernized from time to time, and which also provided territorial air defense, this time from the US Air Force. I would add that, very confusingly, there is also an entirely separate S-300 air defense system, which is used on tracked vehicles by the military, and which was a successor alongside the Buk missile system, which was used famously or allegedly to shoot down MH17. Those became the military, the ground force or army systems that replaced the S-4, S-6, SAM-6 and SAM-8s of the 1960s. But anyway, so we have the A135 and the S-300 systems of the 1970s and 1980s. And by all accounts, these are extremely advanced systems indeed. And now we have the successors of those systems, and these successors are now appearing. The S-400 system, which is appearing in large numbers, the S-500, which I'm going to talk about in this program, and the A235, which provides ballistic missile defense for Moscow, and which is replacing the A135 of the 1970s. Now, the S-500 system is something of an enigma, and there's been a great deal of discussion of what exactly it is and how it operates. The Russians have now, for the first time, released film of this system in operation and in test, and it's clear that, like all modern Russian air defense systems, including those which are used for air defense of the homeland, it uses a mobile vehicle. So it's a mobile system launched from canisters on a very large transport erector vehicle, a kind of giant truck, but one which can maneuver around and which is not fixed to one location, where it could itself, of course, become a target. So what does the S-500 actually do? And this is where I think a lot of the confusion arises, because, of course, there is a temptation to see it purely as an anti-aircraft system, when, in fact, the Russians have made clear that it is also capable of shooting down cruise missiles and indeed even ballistic missiles. But there's also a tendency to confuse it with the A235, which is this very advanced anti-ballistic missile system, which has been built around Moscow to provide the Russian capital with defense from US intercontinental missiles which might be launched against it. And I read in several places comments to the effect that the S-500, like the American THAAD system, is principally designed to shoot down missiles, and that it is in fact a pure anti-ballistic missile system. Well, it's not. It's clearly got a much more expansive role than that. And this is where, of course, much uncertainty and confusion about it exists. But clearly, it is able to shoot down aircraft and cruise missiles and ballistic missiles, and perhaps in some places intercontinental ballistic missiles and their warheads. And the Russians say that it can also hit targets in space, or at least low Earth orbit, and that it is the first system capable of doing that. Now, one doesn't know quite what that means when they talk about space. Space can be a flexible subject. It might mean perhaps more plausibly it means the upper atmosphere of the Earth as opposed to space as such. It doesn't seem to be an anti-satellite system, which some people have thought that it might be. So this is a very formidable system, and another aspect of it is that apparently it is designed to be capable of shooting down hypersonic missiles and hypersonic aircraft. If that is true, if that is indeed the case, then it is the first air defense system in the world that can do that. That all points to an extremely advanced and very complex system, and one which probably is rather expensive. It seems that it is intended to supplement and work with the S-400 air defense system, which is also nowadays very well known, and which is essentially an anti-aircraft as opposed to an anti-missile system. So these two systems, the S-400 and the S-500, are apparently intended to be complementary. And both the S-400 and the S-500, like the S-300 before them, are systems which do not consist of just one type of missile. They each consist of a family of different missiles, and it seems that some of these missiles have different speeds and different ranges. And the most important point about the S-500 is that its missiles apparently are very fast. We don't know how fast, and they are also capable of striking targets, aerial targets, at very great ranges, much greater ranges than the S-400 system is. And it seems that the S-400 and the S-500 are going to share radars as part of an integrated defense system. The new radars having been developed alongside the S-500, and that these radars have exceptionally long range and great accuracy and can apparently, we are told, track even stealth aircraft. Well, that's what the Russians say. And so what we're looking at increasingly is an integrated air defense system, one where the S-400 targets aircraft and perhaps some missiles, and then relies on the S-500 to target aircraft and missiles at even longer ranges, and which is also capable of providing a high degree of ballistic missile defense, including defense against hypersonic systems. And it seems that, as the Russians often do, there are plans to build in the future, not very soon, but at some point in the future, large warships which will be able also to take these missile systems to sea. Anyway, that is where we are. That is what these two systems, the S-400 and the S-500, are intended to do. The even more advanced A235 Noodle, to give it its full name, will be used primarily to provide anti-ballistic defense of Moscow, and that, it seems, rather confusingly, also uses two or possibly even three different systems, one of which has a nuclear warhead for striking ballistic missile targets at very long ranges, but the other two, which have hypersonic speeds, being intended to provide point defense of Moscow for any missiles or warheads, nuclear warheads, that are able to penetrate the shield provided by the longer range system. So we're going to have in Russia a very highly integrated air defense system with the S-500, the S-400 and the A235 also fulfilling different roles, but each complementing each other in different ways. And I said that the A235 is deployed around Moscow, but with the United States, of course, having torn up the anti-ballistic missile treaty during the period of the Bush administration, it is conceivable that the Russians, once they have finished deploying their system in and around Moscow, might decide to deploy the A235 in other places too. Who knows? Anyway, this is an air defense system of a sort that no other country has. It possesses a density and a sophistication which no country, not the United States, not China, not any other country, can match to this degree. I said right at the beginning of this program that the trigger for the development by the Soviets of the S-25 system in the 1950s was a Soviet concern that the US Air Force was far more powerful than their own, and their decision to try to balance the power of the US Air Force by constructing an air defense system based on surface-to-air missiles. And it's in fact the case that even as first the Soviet Union and Russia developed a powerful air force, one capable of giving a good account of itself, even against that of the United States, they continued to work very hard on developing surface-to-air missiles. And it does seem to me that the West, or the world at large, has never fully accepted or understood the enormous change to the way in which battles are fought that these air defense systems that the Russians began to create in the 1950s has made. Briefly, the appearance of the S-25 and S-75 and S-125 systems in the 1950s already began to create a crisis for the US Air Force's bomber force, which to a great extent it has never really overcome, as it has struggled to find ways of penetrating the air defense system that has been formed by these missiles. We have had all kinds of strange and exotic American bomber programs. There was the B-70 Valkyrie bomber in the 1960s, which was supposed to fly at 3 times the speed of sound. There was the B-58 Convair, which was also going to be supersonic. There was the B-1 Lancer, which was also going to be supersonic, which was in fact supersonic. There was the B-2 Stealth bomber. All of these are attempts to somehow defeat the Soviet and now the Russian air defense systems which have been developed around these missiles. And it should be said straightforwardly that I doubt very much that we would have seen stealth technology develop in aircraft if the Soviets and then the Russians had not developed an air defense system like this, and that the whole nature of air war would be completely different if the Soviets and the Russians had not taken the line that they took in the 1950s and hadn't persisted with it ever since. Now, it is true to say that no air defense system is entirely foolproof. It's always possible for aircraft to penetrate it, and in the event of a Third World War, which hopefully is something we will never see, it's likely that some American bombers would get through and would be able to wreak enormous devastation if they were to do so. Having said that, it's nonetheless the case that it's highly likely that a majority would not do so. And it is important always to understand that when the United States has encountered Russian-built or Soviet-built air defense systems in various places around the world, such as in North Vietnam, or as the Israelis did in the Yom Kippur War when they fought the Egyptians and the Syrians, it's important to say that the North Vietnamese and the Egyptians and the Syrians did not have the kind of enormously structured and layered defense system that first the Soviets and now the Russians have developed. Moreover, the systems which exist today, the S-400, the S-500, the A235 Noodle, are of a completely different order of sophistication from those which existed in the 1950s and the 1960s. And it is a fact that the United States found that when it was up against an integrated air defense system using Soviet-era missiles in the bombing war against Yugoslavia in 1999, it found that that air defense system was something that caused it immense problems. But that system which the Yugoslavs had, though more advanced and more structured and more integrated than those that the United States has encountered in its other wars, bears no resemblance to the kind of system the Soviets might have fielded, and even less resemblance to the kind of system the Russians would field today. Suffice to say that the Russians have established some elements of this system in Syria to defend their airbase at Khmeimim. This is the famous S-400 system that was deployed there, and it's supplemented by tactical missiles of a shorter range, like the Pantsir and the Buk. And the United States has been very careful to keep well out of the way of this system and its radars and its missiles. Indeed, when the US Air Force has been tracked by the radars of this system, this Russian system, in Syria, it has tended to avoid conducting operations in areas where it is being tracked by those radars, even if they are far away from where the Russians are believed to be. So that gives one a sense of how nervous the Americans are about these missile systems and how difficult it is for the Americans, or indeed anyone else, to encounter or defeat these air defense systems, and also how potent these air defense systems potentially are. The Russians, I should say, have invested not only very heavily in developing these air defense systems, but in my opinion, and this is a point which is not generally understood, they prioritize these air defense missile systems above their fighter aviation. So when people, for example, comment on the fact that the Russians still haven't fielded a fifth generation fighter, though they are about to do so now, and that Russian fighter jets still don't use ASAR radars as the US fighter jets do, it's largely because ASAR radars that the Russians do produce in increasing numbers have been sent and used as part of their air defense system, not so much for their fighter jets. I'm not saying, by the way, that the Russians have neglected their air force. That would obviously be a ridiculous thing to say. But it is an air force that supplements the air defense system, which is based on surface-to-air missiles. It does not substitute for it, and that is an essential point to understand. Now, there are a number of further things to say about the S-500, which is that it seems unlikely that for the time being, the Russians are going to export it, because it does seem to be an extremely advanced system, more advanced even than the S-400, and it seems to be very much geared to Russian needs, and it's not obvious or easy to see why the Russians would want to export it to most of the countries that they are in friendship with. But of course, it's always possible that the Russians themselves might just decide to deploy it overseas. Now, I've done a number of recent programs about the base that the Russians have established in Syria, about how that base now has 2 runways, about how the Russians have deployed heavy bombers to this base, and also MiG-31 strike aircraft equipped with hypersonic anti-ship missiles to this base, and how this base is, of course, protected by S-400 missile systems. Of course, if the Russians were to decide to deploy the S-500 to defend the base also, alongside the S-400, then, of course, it would not just be the naval balance in the Mediterranean that would be changed. We would have, in the S-500 in Syria, an anti-aircraft system and an anti-missile system whose range would be such that it would be able to extend Russian air power or Russian aerial reach, air defense reach, right across the eastern Mediterranean. So American aircraft flying from Crete, for example, where the United States does have a base, an important naval base, might find themselves tracked by Russian radars and also potentially targets for Russian air defense missiles, which is something that the United States and NATO air forces in the Mediterranean have never experienced. And of course, what applies to NATO and the United States also must apply to Israel, which would also find itself, for the first time in its history, neighboring a country, Syria, in which the Russians will have positioned an air defense system of extraordinary potency, one which could certainly do an enormous amount of damage to the Israeli Air Force if it was ever used against it, which I suspect it never will be. So the S-500, in that respect, is potentially a geostrategic game changer. But there is also another factor to take into account, and that is that though I said that the Russians are unlikely to export the S-500, there is one country which might be the exception, and that country is China. And here I ought to say that it might not just be the S-500 that the Russians might decide to export, but on the assumption that technology transfer between China and Russia takes place, which it does, then it's quite possible that the Russians might also decide to provide the Chinese with access to some of the technology that makes up the S-500 system. And we could see certain consequences which might flow from that. Now, in a recent program that I did about the change in the naval balance in the Pacific, I pointed out that many of China's assets, which it could bring to bear in a conflict with the US Navy, particularly one that was within proximate distance of the Chinese coastline, many of the assets are actually located on land. One of the priorities of the US carrier force would be to launch airstrikes against these assets, these Chinese assets, on the Chinese mainland. Some of them might be outside the US's reach. But in addition, if these assets are defended by systems like the S-500 and the S-400, of which the Chinese, by the way, already have, then the idea of launching aerial attacks on the Chinese mainland becomes extremely difficult. But there is also a further factor to bear in mind, which is that I also discussed in that long program I did about Chinese naval ships. The Chinese cruisers and Chinese destroyers, which the Chinese Navy is increasingly deploying, seem to have, or are alleged to have, air defense systems that are less capable than the analogous Aegis system used by the US Navy's Arleigh Burke destroyers. Well, of course, if China is able to gain access to technology like that of the S-500, and given the fact that the Russians are already known to have plans to navalize the S-500 system, then it's conceivable, it's very easy, in fact, to see how that situation could change and how the Chinese might surprisingly quickly perhaps acquire air defense systems for their warships, which, instead of being behind in technological capability from those of the United States, actually exceed that technological capability. Well, we will see. The fact is that Russian air defense missiles and the Russian air defense system have, as I said, changed the face of war to a degree, as I said, that is rarely acknowledged. And it's perhaps worth finishing the program by mentioning the man who apparently played the biggest role in organizing the original program, the S-25 program of the early 1950s, and who integrated all the various systems, the radar systems, the radio electronic systems, the early computers, and of course the missiles into one single functioning system, and which the Russians have been able to build upon ever since to arrive at that pinnacle of excellence in this technology which they now have. That individual apparently was a Soviet radio engineer called Alexander Raspletin. It is striking that the company, the Russian industrial group, Almaz-Antey, which designs and builds these air defense systems, including both the S-400 and the S-500, its most important division, Almaz, is actually bears Raspletin's name as part of its title. And by the way, the Soviets also named a crater on the moon after him. So Raspletin is fairly well honoured and perhaps fairly well known in Russia itself. But for a man who organised a programme which had a reach that perhaps, as I said, can only compare in its revolutionary effect on war, on the nuclear program that the United States carried out in the 1940s, the Manhattan Project, it's perhaps surprising that Raspletin is not better known. It seems to me that he is one of those people, alongside Oppenheimer and von Braun, who changed the face of war in the 20th century and whose shadow extends into the 21st century and who deserves to be far better known than he is. Well, thank you for joining me for this program today. I look forward to you joining me in future programs on this channel. Please also check out our main channel, the Duran, where I do programs with my colleague and friend Alex Christoforou. And please also remember to check out Alex's channel. You'll find links under this video. Please also check us out on our various other platforms, BitChute, Rumble, ODYSEE, SuperU, and Locals. And we now have, by the way, plans on how to develop these platforms, which we will discuss shortly and make known to you in future. And please also support us to the extent that you can via PayPal, Patreon, and Subscribestar, and also by coming to our shop, by the amazing things you will find there, our famous mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, and all the rest. And thank you for joining me for this program today, and I hope you will join me in future programs, both on this channel and on our main channel. And please, if you like this video, remember to tick the like button, and also to please check your subscription to this channel. And again, thank you for joining me today, and have a wonderful day.